So the other day I came across an interesting post by Adam Wathan about renderless components in Vue.js. And I thought this was an interesting idea, and it's something I've sort of dabbled in back in the Angular beta, but it's been a long time, so I wanted to try and translate his concept of renderless components into an Angular context. So the idea is you would have a component that out of the box can have its own view, which is what you see here in this first component where I have a tagging input, and you can see I have tags here and I can add other tags. But then it would also be nice to provide a way for a custom view to be provided by a calling context, and that's exactly what we see here in this second version, which as you can see is rendering the same data. We just added nifty and pants, and those are here and here, and I can remove it, and you see it gets removed from both contexts, and then I can also add tags here, and you can see again they show up in both contexts. And if we look at the HTML, what you can see is we have a tags input custom element, and that's what's providing the default view. And then we have a tags input light element, and that is the version of the component that does not provide its own view but requires the view to be defined here in the calling context of the application component. So let's take a look at the application component to see how this is being consumed. So here is the HTML for my application component, and you can see here is my tags input, and as you can see there's no view being provided in the within the bounds of this tag. All of the view definition is encapsulated within the tags input, and we're getting that out of the box view. Now the tags input light component, on the other hand, defines its own view for how it wants to interact with the business logic of the tags component. Now it does this by creating a template reference tags input here with the pound sign, the hash sign, and what that does is provide us a reference to the underlying component instance associated with this custom element. We're then using the tags input component reference to invoke the public properties and methods of that component. So here you can see I'm calling add tag and I'm passing in the form value. Here I'm looping over the list of public tags, and then here I'm removing a tag, again all on the public API of the component in this reference, which is associated with this tags input light. Now these are two different elements, right? Tags input versus tags input light. Technically, I could have smushed all of this logic into a single component, but I felt like that would have created for messy code and would have made the code in the calling context a little harder to reason about. In this case, it's very clear that we have two tags with two distinct responsibilities. The tags input comes with a view. The tags input light does not come with a view and requires the view to be defined in the calling context. I find that this approach adheres to the principle of least surprise and allows the developer to understand a little bit more easily how things are working. But let's take a look now at how these components are being implemented under the hood. First, let's look at the light version, which provides the business logic. So here is my tags input light, and this might be a little bit confusing, but it's not actually called tags input light component, it's tags input core, and this is just from an internal standpoint. The core sounded easier to reason about than the light version. But essentially the core version of the component does nothing but project content from the calling context. So essentially there is no view template here. The view template is the calling context of it's the child content of the calling context. But this core component does provide all of the business logic here around interacting with those tags collection and outputting events and listening for bindings. So you can see again we have the add tag method, we have the remove tag method, and then of course we have the public tags collection and the tags change output binding, which again if we jump back into the app component you can see is these are the methods that we're consuming here on that template reference. So again, the light version, or the aka core version, provides the business logic, but is essentially a renderless component in so much as it has no view logic of its own. It's simply projecting content provided by the calling context. Now let's take a look at how the tags input is implemented. So the tags input, as you can see, provides a default view here with my list of tags and my input for adding a new tag. And the tags input component, you can see, provides no business logic. Instead, what it does is it extends that core component, right? So it brings in all of the business logic provided by the core component, and then essentially just attaches a view to that core component business logic. So if you squint, what you can see is that the tags input component is really very akin to the version in our app component, which takes that light version, or that aka core version, and then provides a view to associate with the business logic. That's what this tags input component is doing. It's pulling in that core component, which brings in the business logic, and then is providing a view to consume that business logic. And again, I could have found a way to smush this all into a single component, but I feel like breaking this up into two components keeps each of the components very simple and easy to reason about, and I think it just becomes cleaner from both a development and a consumption standpoint. So one thing to note, though, is that if we look back at the HTML that gets generated, right, our tags input here, I'm calling this a renderless component. Sorry, but when we look at the element, right, we see that the element actually gets rendered. It's just that it has no internal view associated with it. So there are no truly renderless components in Angular the way that there are in Vue.js or React.js, where you could just return null and the component essentially disappears. The element, the top level element in an Angular component always gets rendered, which again, I think makes Angular elements easier to reason about because there's no violation of the principle of least surprise. I see an element in my markup and that element shows up in the output unless the calling context takes steps through things like ngIf or other means to hide that element. And again, all of this approach here is trying to keep things simple and easy to reason about, breaking the tags, breaking the component into two focused components, one with a view, one without a view, and then of course always having the top level element are all ways to keep the code effective and also easier to reason about.